So I'm going to read Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 4. Okay, and I want you to notice the difference between this and the biblical story. Okay. Now the sons of Noah were three, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, born 100 years before the deluge. The first of all descended from the mountains into the plains and fixed their habitation there, and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very loath to come down to the higher places, from the higher places, to venture to follow their examples. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. So here you have what Bob was talking about. One of the problems was they're supposed to scatter, and they didn't. But they were so ill instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities, and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been guilty. For when they flourished with numerous youth, God admonished them again to send out colonies. But they imagined the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful conditions they were in, they did not obey him. Nay, they added to their disobedience to the divine will and suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that they, being divided asunder, they might be more easily oppressed. So instead, they thought that instead of going out, like the God told them to, that would lead to oppression by God. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determinations of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great and so strongly built that thereby its great height seemed upon view to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language, which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower, and of the confusion of the language, when she says thus: when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they would thereby ascend to the heaven. But the God sent storms of wind to overthrow the tower, and gave everyone his particular language. For this reason it was that the city was called Babylon. But as to the plain of Shinar and the country of Babylonia, Hestiaeus mentions it when he says thus: such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter, Annihilus, and came to Shinar of Babylonia. Thus ends Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 4. What do you notice first before we go into what I think you should notice about this? Gives a little bit more detail, right? Even some thoughts behind their actions, where the Bible doesn't. Okay. Do you trust it? It's written by a Jew called Josephus. Yeah, it is another account. Okay. I want you to notice a few things. First, the sense of newspaper reporting in this, right? Doesn't it give you just a sense of like a newspaper report? Even quoting some other sources, right? So I get that sense out of it. The sense of commentary involved. Do you notice all the commentary? It doesn't just give you it's more like modern day, kind of bending the facts to add a commentary to it, okay? Whenever I read the paper nowadays, I always can see a bent behind the paper, okay? You see a bent behind what's going on. A sense of commentary, afraid of the lower grounds because of the flood. So they said, well, you know, they didn't at first want to go in there, but they were afraid of the flood again. So ill-instructed that they disobeyed God. So you can tell that Josephus is kind of saying, you know, they were told not to do this, but they just didn't get it. They were so ill-instructed, in an interesting way to put it. Thought they would be oppressed if they spread out. Okay, so again, he's adding a little commentary there. Multitudes were ready to follow Nimrod. All of these statements are statements of commentary about what's going on behind it. You hear the details of Nimrod and his power to control, whereas the Bible, Scripture itself, we talked about last week, just has a very brief statement about Nimrod, that he was a mighty warrior. Okay, that's about it. The denigration of Babylon, did you notice that? The denigration of Babylon. It's an interesting part of it, that we don't really get a sense of with a surface reading of the Scripture version.
And was that on the site of Babylon, the later Babylon? It was the same site?
Yeah. Okay. Now, before you read the italics in the bottom, some of you probably cheated. When did Josephus live? 37 to 100 AD. So he was a contemporary, not of Jesus. He was born about the time Jesus died, so that he was a contemporary of many of the apostles, okay, during that time, Roman rule. He was actually Flavius Josephus. He was a Roman citizen. And in fact, a lot of Jews believe he was a traitor because he became a historian for the Romans. Okay, so he worked for the Romans as a historian. You can tell by his writing that it was not inspired, but interesting, that it utilized a lot of other extra-biblical sources known to the Jews of his time, and used a lot of Greek and Roman references as well. Sybil is a character in Homer. If you ever read the story of Homer, that's where Sybil came from. And then however you pronounce it, Hesiod is one of Plato's students. Okay, so he's one of Plato's students.
If Sybil is a character, how can you...
It's also a character and a name.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
I was going to say, how can you quote a character?
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, I'm just using,
I knew
yeah.
with Josephus, that wasn't like New Reformation.
Right. Nice. All right, so it's just different. And again, you get the picture of Josephus going through a lot of the old scraps of Jewish writings. Not just what we would consider scripture today in the Genesis scroll. You got the feeling that there were other scraps of ancient writings that he kind of drew from and put together to make his account of the flood.
What was that vessel, Jupiter Annihilis?
Yeah, I tried to find what that was, the sacred vessels, and I couldn't find it.
Because Jupiter's a Roman god name.
Yeah, so.
It doesn't sound contemporary to when the story...
Well, it would be contemporary to Josephus.
Right, but
they would all know what he
when the
was
story
saying.
happened.
Right. So, but it's something that I tried to, again, Google it or Wikipedia it, but Jupiter, of course, you can find a lot of, but that last part of it, and how that references to the Tower of Babel, I couldn't find the connection there, so maybe somebody a lot smarter than me can find that. All right.
So we know where Babylon was.
We know where Babylon was.
So why
We
haven't
still
we
have
found the
ancient...
ruins of that?
Why do we not have the ruins of that?
Have we found the ruins of that?
Maybe.
Seems like we should have.
Maybe.
It was as big as it was.
I don't know, every time we went someplace in Israel, they would say, this used to be, this was what they built after it was, you know, completely demolished. So, you know, you know, almost, I'm not sure if we went to one place where the original building stood that hadn't been demolished and something else hadn't been built on it, so.
Yeah, even Jericho, I think Jericho, they have 7
Yeah.
layers on Jericho. And a lot of these cities, you just layer upon layer upon layer. And especially something built out of basically mud brick, probably wouldn't have lasted. It was stone.
It was fun.
Fired, so it was more ceramic than anything
Yeah.
else, but still, it's. All right, let's read the scripture, Tower of Babel. Just again, a short 9 verses. Now the whole world had one language and one common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. All right, so what is the difference between the 2 stories? What do you notice right away?
No one's in charge.
Say that again.
In the second story, no one's in charge.
Noah's in charge.
No one's.
No one
Is in
Yeah,
charge.
instead of Nimrod, right?
Right.
Okay.
It's like the Reader's Digest version.
The Reader's Digest version. Okay. Also good. What's the point of the narrative? Again, it seems in the Josephus you get the commentary behind it, where you understand, well, you know, they did this because of this, and then they did this because of this, and then Nimrod became a tyrant, and this, and did this, and this, and this. Okay, but what's the point of this story?
This one is more from God's point of view, what God saw, what
God's
He
point
did.
of view. Very good. Okay, it's a definite change in perspective here.
Basically, to keep them from being too powerful.
Keep them from being too powerful. Isn't that an interesting line? If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan will be impossible for them. Wow. Isn't that an interesting phrase? We could spend a lot of time talking about just that. Okay, just that. I've used this phrase, I don't know if I made it up or if I heard it somewhere, that says, people united can do amazing, powerful things. And that's why God doesn't let us do it very often. Right? He doesn't let us do it very often. Right? So, yeah, there's a sense of that in here as well. We're on page 112 there, Bill, if you're catching up with us.
Thank you.
All right. Let's look at the literary nuances, something that you wouldn't get in a surface reading, page 113. There's a lot of it in this. This and maybe Genesis 29. This is probably one of my favorite passages in Genesis, which of course Genesis and Exodus are my favorite books, right? So, this is probably one of my favorite passages because in these little 9 verses, this little story, there is so much jam-packed into this that you should, at the end of this, be going, wow. The author of this is definitely inspired and definitely amazingly skilled at language. That should be your response because how much he packed into this, Josephus couldn't. Even with his commentary, he could not pack in as much as the author of this passage did, just using literary nuances, just using different word phrases and unusual words that you won't find anywhere else in Scripture, but you find it here. So first, the author uses this little literary masterpiece to use numerous plays on words and sounds which make meaningful and ironic links. Again, good English reading of it. You can get a nice surface reading But you're not going to get all this beauty of this passage until you dig in. Come let us is the translation NIV. The author uses this phrase as a divine answer to mankind's call to action. The actual phrase translated as come, or in the King James Version as go to, is the Hebrew word yahab, which normally means give me permission or permit me to. Okay, you've heard that before, right? Permit me to do this or that, right? But here it is in the command voice, which eliminates the permission part of it and turns it into a truculent, I am going to do this whether you like it or not. Right? So when it says, they said to each other, come let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. It's not saying, hey, with your permission, let's bake bricks. Okay, no, he's saying we are going to do this whether you like it or not. It's almost an arrogant stand against God right there already. And they say it twice, come let us build ourselves a city with a tower. So that same voice. And then God uses it back, almost like mocking them. He says the same phrase right back to them, mocking them. I'm going to do this, whether you like it or not. All right? Name, not be scattered, versus Babel and scattered. Again, an ironic twist with God's intervention. They wanted to make a name for themselves, but the name they ended up with was babbler, or baby talker. Okay? They wanted to make a name for themselves. Okay? So when you hear the name, what's a name that? MacArthur. Oh, that's maybe too old for some of you. Eisenhower. When you hear that name, it says something to you. Roosevelt. Okay? Churchill. When you hear that name, it means something. That's what they wanted to do, to have that kind of a name that not only would people know it, but it would mean something impressive. And so what was their name? Baby talker. That's what it ended up being. Babbler. One who babbles. So there was this ironic twist that was put into it, in the phrase. Okay, Shinar. The plain of Shinar was known in Moses' time as the land of the Assyrians, Akkadians, Babylonians. Okay, the Akkadians branched out into the Assyrians and Babylonians. So the Akkadians were the forefathers of the Assyrians and Babylonians. Babylon was further south, where the Tigris and Euphrates split. Babylon is kind of right in the middle there on the south end, whereas Assyria was more northern part of between the two rivers. Okay, so that was Acadia. It was known. So that plain that had those two rivers in was the plain of Shinar. And so that was known during Moses' time. Again, remember, we are speaking to people of Moses' time. We're not speaking to us. We're not speaking to pre-Abraham people. We're speaking to people at Moses' time. So they would have recognized this plain of Shinar. So Babylon and Acadia was a great nation at that time. Remember, they were one of the top nations, along with Egypt, that were fighting in there for the Palestine area. Their sacred mountains, okay, or ziggurats, were special. Okay, they had these special ziggurats that they would have all over the place. And if you've toured that area, you've seen some of the ziggurats. That's what these pictures are more of than of a tower. Okay, they're mainly ziggurats that have that kind of spiral sense to them, or just a step sense to them. They weren't quite pyramids, but similar to pyramids. All right? So it's denigrating that whole area. The Akkadian myth of their people and language being the world's first, and others sprang from them. The thought at that time was the Akkadians were the first people of the earth, because that's where the Garden of Eden was, the Tigris and Euphrates, right? People believe that's where the Garden of Eden was, so that's where the first people came from, that plain of Shinar, and the special first people, first language. So it was a denigration of that as well. Okay. The Akkadian myth that they were the first people created on earth, notice, as the men moved eastward, means they settled in Shinar out of disobedience, not because it was the first of anything. That, in fact, made a case for Egypt being the land of the Garden of Eden. Okay? So they're denigrating Shinar as the first place, because it says in this passage, after the flood, as men moved eastward, so from Palestine, some people say even from Egypt, as they moved eastward toward, and then they settled in Shinar. So they weren't the first people. Mankind moved eastward and settled in Shinar. So it's denigrating that whole part of it. All right, you tracking with me here on how they're denigrating all of this that has to do with the big nation of the time? Tower. Now, that's why I said it's not quite a ziggurat. In Hebrew, it is migdal. All other uses in Scripture of it signifies as a 3 to 4 story stone structure where they can look out in protection over their sheep, or a corner tower of a walled city where watchers can see an enemy coming. The insinuation here, what the people of that time would have heard, is a place where they could see the enemy, God in this case, coming from miles away. Okay? Now, I've preached this mistakenly, that the Tower of Babel is just like Jacob's ladder, just like a pyramid. It's not. It's something different. It's something different. It's a migdal. It's not the ladder, Jacob's ladder that's talking about, because Jacob's ladder could just as easily be translated as a pyramid. Okay? So it's a connection between God and man. That's not what this tower is. This tower is a migdal. And that's what's used in Scripture. Frankie preached on this, I think Christmas, a couple of years ago, about the Migdal Ezer, okay, which is where they probably, where Joseph and Mary gave birth to Jesus, inside a tower like that, the Migdal Ezer, or Eder, okay? And so it's mainly one of those protection towers looking over sheep, or those corner towers that you've seen on castles, but they're in the corner so that you can look out in protection over the city. All right? The city, in Hebrew, it's Iyr, Iyr, or a place of watching, of guarding, or simply where people are. It's against the above, it again has the above insinuation of circling the wagons against the enemy. That's what the insinuation is. It could also say, let us build a people, a city, insinuating that they did not like the people they were supposed to be under God's direction. Okay, so there's two things here in building this city. This is different than, remember, Israel has never been a part of a city. They've been wandering nomads, wandering shepherds. And cities has the implication of something to protect yourself, circling the wagons, protecting yourself from outside oppressors. That's why you put a wall on the city. That's why you put the migdal up on the city. That's the insinuation of a city. Protection from an outside enemy. So with the migdal and the city, the whole insinuation is we're going to protect ourselves from God doing this to us again. That flood thing. Okay, that's the insinuation here. Now, bricks, bake, tar, or bitumen, if you look in some versions, these are Akkadian Babylonian building techniques that may not have been familiar to the Hebrews. That's why you notice a little bit more detail there. In Egypt, bricks cured in the sun, not in a furnace. Where did the Israelites come from? Egypt, right? So they were used to building bricks. But these are different. Because they would just put, because of the hot sun in Egypt, they would just smooth them out with straw in them, usually, hopefully. Okay? And then they'd let them sit out in the sun. They still do that today. If you've been in Egypt, you can see them, all these bricks sitting out in the sun. Okay, that they put together. In Egypt, bricks cured in the sun and not a furnace. They used more mud for mortar, or the stones were simply fitted without any kind of mortar. Right? Which is what we saw. They were really good at making a seam that was unbelievably small in all these stones. They never used mortar. Okay? They used bricks, and where they would put other mud in between, or they used stones. Emphasizing the waterproof, or waterproofing. The bitumen, or the tar, is a waterproofing. So not only would they cure them, it's almost like a ceramic kind of thing, where they would cook this clay. Okay, not only that, for waterproofing, what they did was use tar as mortar so the water could not get in between them. It's interesting that bitumen or tar was used in mummification in Egypt. So they knew what that was, but they never thought of using it in building. Egyptians never used bitumen or tar for building. They used it for mummification. Right? Waterproofing there. So all right, now you're getting a different picture of this already, right? The poetic chiasm. Page 114. Chiasm, another poetic tool that's used. All right, and you can tell based on the language. Again, in English we don't see it as much, but the Hebrews would see this immediately. Okay? One language, common speech. So you have A1 matches A2. And again, with a chiasm, the Greek letter chi, which is X, okay, C-H-I, and then you would have A1 matches A2. You'd have B1 matches B2. C1 matches C2. And then whatever this D is, or however many they put in the chiasm, this is a focus of the story. That's what they want you attention to be drawn to, that middle section. As each one of these moves itself toward the middle section. That's called a chiasm. It's a poetic use of language. Okay? So that's why I bold-faced it and made it very obvious. A1, one language, common speech, settled. A2, look at the bottom. Babel, confused language and scattered. So you can see the relationship between the two. They're opposites in this case. B1, come let us make and build. B2, come let us go down and confuse. C1, make a name, not be scattered over the face of the earth. Those words, name and face, are the key ones that you don't see in English. But in Hebrew, they stand out. If they do this, name, that actual word is still used, nothing will be impossible for them to face. Okay, so they have name and face in both of those. That's one you probably wouldn't see in English. And then finally, the center phrase, the Lord came down to see. The Lord came down to see. What does that say to you when you hear the phrase, the Lord came down and saw? What does that mean?
He is in charge, he is in control.
He's in charge, he's in control. Very much so. And he's actively engaged in what you're doing. Right? He's not this God that's way far away, that never comes down, that never figures out what's going on. He came down and he saw. He saw what you were doing. That's the focal point of the story. God is involved in these people's lives. He's involved. All right? There's other poetic techniques. The text plays on the sound of raw bitumen and brickstone. In Hebrew, they would hear Levena la Aven, and then hear Hemer la Homer. Okay, you hear the Levena la Aven, Hemer la Omen, la Homer. Okay, so they'd hear the connection of the words there. An equivalent but not coherent English translation would be, come let us brick bricks and burn a burning. Okay, that's what they heard. Come let us brick bricks and burn a burning. Okay, that's the equivalent of what they heard. It was a little poetry going on there, even though it doesn't make sense to us. It made sense to them with that equivalent kind of thing. The word language occurs 5 times in these brief 9 verses. Literally, in Hebrew, it means lip. Lip of the mouth, or edge of a river. A play on words that would have a double meaning intended, since Shinar is in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates. So you're on the lip of the river, and the language for that lip, the lip of your speaking. All right, so another play on words there. The tower that reaches to the heavens. In Hebrew, the word is Shemayim, which is an ancient title, ancient and little used words for heavens. More specifically, it's for loft. It is thought to be an aberration of the name Shem, Shemayim, Shem, or a misquote or a confusion. In other words, the language itself shows a confusion or denigration of the good even after the flood. Shemayim is only used here. Okay, they're very similar words for heavens, but this is like a confusion of the words for heavens. And so a lot of the Bible translations, when they look at it, they will change it from loft to heavens. So we can reach up to the loft, so we can reach up to the heavens. And that really is a mistranslation. What they're Missing is, I think, and many of the authors or many of the commentators I've read about, are saying that that was very purposefully put in there. That they're going to reach to the Shemayim, which is this confusion. They think they're reaching to the heavens, but all they're really doing is getting up to the loft. Okay, so they very purposefully confused the language, babbled the language, even in the passage itself. Now, after all of that, what's the point, the message of this narrative? What's the point of the message? Is that my camera beeping up there?
Yeah.
Good thing we got yours going then. Again, God is in control, right? As much as we think we are, God comes down and sees what we're doing, what's going on. That's the point poetically. That's the point using all the story. We think we're in control. We think we can stand against God and build a barrier, literally build a barrier against God with our city and with our tower, that we can keep God from coming down, from being a part of what we're doing. But God just says, hey, come, let us go down. Right? He's in control. As much as we think we are, he is. And he's a part of it. He's an active part of what we do. Okay? See some question marks on your forehead there, Glenda.
Well, you make it sound like him coming down is a figurative speech rather than literally coming down, and I question that. I mean,
Is there a difference between the two? Literally coming down versus figuratively coming down?
figuratively coming down as in, doing all the work from heaven and coming down and,
Right.
because, it doesn't have to be here to do it, so. But
Okay.
I think at that point that there was still physical contact.
Okay.
Um,
So literally God walking around and seeing what they were building and seeing what they were doing. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that.
And he says, let us.
Interesting phrase. I was wondering if anyone was going to bring that up, because again, it's plural. Okay, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago about why it's in plural. This one not specifically. I think this one refers to the previous ones where the people say, "Come, let us do this. Come, let us do this," and he says, "Let us do this, or we're going to do this."
But Dad's is plural in earlier parts of Genesis.
Yep, yep. And I have a whole theory on that, which I won't go into again. So you have to go back in the lessons, all right? And I think it's a literary tool to put it into plural. Okay, it's a literary tool that means something more than, I said I wasn't going to go into it, but it means something more than just the plural of gods. There's an insinuation of all in all within it. Okay? There's an insinuation of God is all in all. God encompasses everything. God is all in all. Okay? So that's the insinuation in that literary device, I would call it. All right, but Genesis 11 is not done there. We got 15 minutes to cover the genealogy. Should not be a problem. I'm not going to read it for you. Okay? A couple of things I want you to notice. Genealogy number 1, I'm on page 115 right now, which is out of Genesis 5. It showed the depravity of man increasing. If you remember, we looked at the dates, the times, the years, and then they died. Right? Remember that? Genealogy number 2, Genesis 10, linked the names of these ancients with modern, to the Hebrew, places and cities. So all these ancients, we knew where they come from. It's an ideological tale. Why do we have all these cities with all of these names? Because they're descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay? And what are the order, and who are we a part of, and why are we so special? Because we're descended from Shem, right? We're the Shemites, the Semites, right? And now we have genealogy number 3, which lists from Shem to Abraham. So let's look at the playing with words. 10 generations. Again, remember that? Does that sound familiar? 10 generations. From Shem to the top man, Abraham, Okay, so it starts with Shem and it goes to the top man Abraham, parallels the 10 generations from Seth to Noah in genealogy number 1, with the top man being Noah. Also ends with Noah's 3 sons, as does this one with Terah's 3 sons, the 10 generations. Abraham being one of those 3 sons. I'm going to allow you to look on the next page. It gives you page 116 there, which gives you a little picture of this. I pulled the genealogy from the first one in Genesis 5, where the 10 generations from Seth to Noah, and then the 3 children. And then you have Shem to Abraham, 10 generations, actually to Terah, with Terah's 3 children, Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Okay, but then there is an unusual family tree that we're going to talk about after that. So don't get mired in that right now. Go back to page 115. Notice the missing part of the formula. And then he died. Genesis 11 does not have the phrase, and then he died. It has, he was such and such years old when he had so and so, and he lived another X amount of years, but there's no, and then he died. Do you think that's interesting? All the other ones had such and such, and then he was so many, had other sons and daughters, and then he died. Emphasizing the mortality. Here, it's getting a little different. De-emphasizing the mortality of the people. Notice also the years have been cut in half and then quartered from the ancients. Ancients lived 900 years, right? 900 plus years. Now we have 400, down to 200, down to 100 and some. Okay? So this is a depiction of the movement. This isn't a depiction of sin, which was what we talked about earlier. This is a depiction of the movement from ancient mythology to historic narrative. We're seeing a transition. This is a very transitional piece. Okay, this is just as much an introduction to Abraham, part 2, as it is a conclusion to the whole ancient narrative, the flood stories, the Tower of Babel. Okay, it's kind of it's this transitional thing that's wrapping the two of them up. So you notice Noah living 400 years or ending up with 600, whatever it is, down to Haran or Terah, which only lives 100 and some years. Okay? Numerology, a lot of different thoughts on the numerology of the people. One consistent one that should be is that on the ages from Shem to the leaving of Ur to go to Haran is 365 years. Right? 365 years. So most just believe it's stated above that it's a transition from mythological to historical. That's what this genealogy is trying to show us. We're transitioning from mythological to historical. There's a definite language shifting. Genesis 11, 10 to 26, and Genesis 11, 27 to 32. The second part, or the last part of the chapter, was written in a more modern form of Hebrew. Okay, so there's a definite break there when it talks about the genealogy, blank, blank, did blank, to blank, blank, and then all of a sudden there's a shift where it says, and this is the ancestors of Terah, and it talks about Abraham. So there's this shift in this, between those two verses. The last 5 verses show a transition and an introduction to the patriarchal period. So that last section is another transition. It mentions the death of Haran and the death of Terah. There's no death in all the previous part of that chapter. And all the rest of the genealogy, there's no death in it. Remember, it doesn't say, and then he died. According to the passage, they're still alive, right? Until it gets to that second part, that there's death. It mentions leaving of Ur, the Shinar area, and movement west toward Haran. Remember, the people moved east to plant this city in Shinar, and now we have this movement back west, from Ur to Haran, and then from Haran to Canaan, eventually. But you don't know that yet, okay? We just know that he's leaving that evil place of the flood, and he's starting to move west to Haran. Now, don't get confused. Haran is the name of a person and a name of a place. So don't get that confused, all right? Mentions Lot. Lot is mentioned. Now, Lot is not in that genealogy first part, but he is part of the next stories. The the next narration. So we get the introduction to Lot. Remember, this is this transition. And normally you wouldn't get the son if somebody was not important. Okay, but here we do. We get Lot entering the picture. It mentions Sarah. Okay, female. They usually don't put females in the genealogy. Okay, but here we get Sarah. Sarai. But it's part of the next story. So again, remember, it's both concluding the ancients, the mythological, and getting into the historical. And it mentions Sarah being barren. Now remember, there are themes in Genesis that keeps being followed. One is barrenness. The second theme is the youngest son theme. The barren woman and the youngest son. Those are themes all through Genesis. Just think about it. Those of you who know Genesis, how many barren women do we have? We have Sarah, we have Rebecca, we have Rachel, we have Tamar, we have all these barren women. We also have second son. Who's the second son? Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. They're not the oldest. It doesn't go to the oldest normal son. In fact, Joseph's sons are even switched. If you remember, when Jacob puts Joseph's sons on his knees, he switches Ephraim and Manasseh. And the younger son gets the blessing. Okay? So those themes are starting to be picked up here. We have Sarah being barren. If we were to stop the story here, at the end of verse 11, it would be a very depressing story. One of death, leaving, and barrenness. If we were to stop the story here. Okay? Let's look at the whole genealogy. There's some you're going to want to refer back to this later, and I'll probably put it in once we start talking about all of these, because I put the passages. You'll notice Abraham and Sarah are brother and sister. Did you know that? Okay. They are actually half-brother and sister. Terah had 2 wives. Wife 1 was Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Wife 2 had Sarah, and probably others. So we find that out in Genesis 20. That Abraham and Sarah really are brother and sister. Even so, that adds a little credence or a little mystery behind Abraham presenting in Egypt that Sarah is his sister and not his wife. Okay. Haran has 2 sons, or a daughter and a son. I think that's blue. Yeah, blue meaning female. Milcah and Lot are the children of Haran, the 2 we know about. Now Milcah, Haran died. So Milcah married her uncle, Nahor. They had 2 children that we know of, Rebecca and Laban. Do they sound familiar? Okay, Rebecca and Laban had 2 children, or Laban had 2 children, Leah and Rachel. Does that sound familiar? Rebecca went over to be married to her cousin, or second cousin, depending on how you want to do it, Isaac, which was the son of brother and sister Abram and Sarah. Right? You following so far? Isaac and Rebekah had 2 children, Jacob and Esau. Jacob then married his other cousins, second cousins, Leah and Rachel, to have the 12 tribes of Israel. Wow. Okay, now this isn't part of the genealogy. This is just what's coming up in Genesis. So you see, that's why I put Genesis 29, Genesis 24 for Isaac marrying Rebekah, and how Rebekah was got. Remember, the servant of Abraham was sent back to Haran. And then also Jacob went back to Haran, to Leah, and found Rachel and Leah. All right. And came to Shinar of Babylonia. Thus ends Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 4. What do you notice first before we go into what I think you should notice about this? Gives a little bit more detail, right? Even some thoughts behind their actions, where the Bible doesn't. Okay, do you trust it? It's written by a Jew called Josephus. Yeah, it is another account. Okay. I want you to notice a few things. First, the sense of newspaper reporting in this, right? Doesn't it give you just a sense of like a newspaper report? Even quoting some other sources, right? So I get that sense out of it. The sense of commentary involved. Do you notice all the commentary? It doesn't just give you it's more like modern day, kind of bending the facts to add a commentary to it, okay? Whenever I read the paper nowadays, I always can see a bent behind the paper, okay? You see a bent behind what's going on. A sense of commentary, afraid of the lower grounds because of the flood. So they said, well, you know, they didn't at first want to go in there, but they were afraid of the flood again. So ill-instructed that they disobeyed God. So you can tell that Josephus is kind of saying, you know, they were told not to do this, but they just didn't get it. They were so ill-instructed, in an interesting way to put it. Thought they would be oppressed if they spread out. Okay, so again, he's adding a little commentary there. Multitudes were ready to follow Nimrod. All of these statements are statements of commentary about what's going on behind it. You hear the details of Nimrod and its power to control, whereas the Bible, Scripture itself, we talked about last week, just has a very brief statement about Nimrod, that he was a mighty warrior. Okay, that's about it. The denigration of Babylon, did you notice that? The denigration of Babylon. It's an interesting part of it, that we don't really get a sense of with a surface reading of the Scripture version.
And was that on the site of Babylon, the later Babylon? It was the same site?
Yeah. Okay. Now, before you read the italics and about it, some of you probably cheated. When did Josephus live? 37 to 100 AD. So he was a contemporary, not of Jesus. He was born about the time Jesus died. They did not obey him. Nay, they added to their disobedience to the divine will and suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that they, being divided asunder, they might be more easily oppressed. So instead, they thought that instead of going out, like the God told them to, that would lead to oppression by God. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determinations of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high, sooner than anyone could expect. So I'm going to read Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 4. Okay, and I want you to notice the difference between this and the biblical story. Okay. Now the sons of Noah were three, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, born 100 years before the deluge. The first of all descended from the mountains into the plains and fixed their habitation there, and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very loath to come down to the higher places, from the higher places, to venture to follow their examples. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after a plentiful manner. So here you have what Bob was talking about. One of the problems was they're supposed to scatter, and they didn't. But they were so ill-instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been guilty. For when they flourished with numerous youth, God admonished them again to send out colonies. But they imagined the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the favor of God, but supposing that their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful conditions they were in. But the thickness of it was so great and so strongly built that thereby its great height seemed upon view to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick, cemented together with mortar made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not grown wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that, through multitude of those languages, they should not be able to understand one another. The place wherein they built the tower is now called Babylon, because of the confusion of that language, which they readily understood before. For the Hebrews mean by the word Babel, confusion. The Sibyl also makes mention of this tower, and of the confusion of the language, when she says thus, when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, as if they would thereby ascend to the heaven. But the God sent storms of wind to overthrow the tower, and gave everyone his particular language. For this reason it was that the city was called Babylon. But as to the plain of Shinar and the country of Babylonia, Hestiaeus mentions it when he says thus, such of the priests as were saved took the sacred vessels of Jupiter, annihilated